You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good. I'm conserving my gas, the little that I have left, and driving my gas guzzler car when I'm not conserving gas. But, I'm living in the southeastern United States where our gas supply has been affected by two things. One is a cybersecurity attack that happened on the pipeline that fuels a lot of the southeast. And the second is by panic buying, everybody rushing out to fill up their tank all in the same day. And it's the same thing that happened, right after COVID, where everybody had to rush out and buy toilet paper of all things.
Yeah, I think I saw a picture of you filling gas tanks and putting them into the trunk of a car or something like that. Maybe make a few extra bucks on the side here. The good old American way, yay capitalism, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we all need our bunker.
Right. So it's interesting you bring up the pipeline thing. So the latest that we have as of Wednesday, May 12th, when we're recording this, and this will go out into the internet and all of our listeners on the following Monday, 17th, is that the pipeline hack may have come from the exchange vulnerabilities that were widely touted a couple months ago. I think it was back in March or whatever it is, and yet again, patching didn't get in place and it wasn't remediated, and here we are having another ransomware story, and now we're seeing prices on gas go up because of that, but also because of the economy, I think, starting to open up a little bit here in the U.S. So I guess keep those systems patched.
Well, I think a lot of these ransomware attacks are eventually boil down to basic blocking and tackling. We talked to Dr. Chase Cunningham on the show a few months back, and he mentioned that these types of attacks are moving downstream. Not that utilities and kind of core infrastructures that far downstream, but they're going from government agencies and banks down to kind of companies that haven't seen themselves as prime targets in the past. But I think what you and I have seen with a lot of organizations we work with is that they're understaffed, and you've got a lot of not enough people running around trying to keep up, and they're doing yeoman's work and they're IAM heroes, but if they don't have the tools like MFA everywhere, there's only so much that they can do. And so you run into these kind of situations where nobody wants to end up on the front page of the newspaper, but that's certainly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, job security, I guess, right? Human error gets involved and people start to, fall behind. I think, one thing that we see a lot, right, is underfunded, undermanned, or understaffed teams really doing heroic effort to keep organizations as best as they can, but they can't do it all, right? And they can't do it forever. So something to certainly consider.
Yeah. Well, hey, we've been talking a lot about that by the end of this year, we're hoping to be able to do some business travel again. There's nothing like a year of no business travel to make you miss business travel. But I think you'd agree that probably the favorite business travel is conferences, because we get to see and interact with people in our industry. Hopefully when that starts up again, we'll get to meet a lot of the folks who listen to the podcast. But I had an interesting story, and that our guest today is somebody that I met at a conference, at a couple of ForgeRock conferences that I can recall. And one of the cool things about ForgeRock was, especially in the early days, was the location of some of their conferences, and a lot of times the two that I'm thinking of were in California, which is such a beautiful state. But the Asilomar Conference Center, it was like a pine forest right on the woods, right on the beach, and it was such a cool place to be. And the other was at the Ritz-Carlton at Half Moon Bay in the Bay Area, and wow, I mean, couldn't pick a better place to go for a work trip.
Yeah, I always enjoy going west for that, for conferences. I'm a California guy, so I like it. So speaking of our guests, why don't we go ahead and introduce Nathan Coffing. He is the head of strategy at Cloudentity, welcome Nathan to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really glad to be here, and thanks for going to the Wayback Machine. Those are wonderful conferences, both from a technical point of view as well as, the atmosphere. Absolutely phenomenal for idea sharing and kind of growing in the IAM space.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to kind of interact with folks. I do miss the conference thing. I never thought I would say this is I miss being in the line to get onto a United flight, scrambling with 200 other people trying to fight for overhead space or under seat space, whatever it may be. So maybe at some point here in the future, that'll resume. I know we're going to talk a little bit today about open banking and how that has started to, open up, right, for organizations to start taking advantage of. But before we get to that, I think it would be helpful for the folks who are listening to really kind of understand, your journey. You've known Jim for a long time in prior roles and sort of, the maturation of your own career. But how did you get into the IAM space? Is it something that you chose, or did you choose it?
Well, we got to go in the way back machine, back to the Netscape iPlanet days, where I was actually at Boeing working just in the cyber side, building some of the initial firewalls. And then Sun chose me somehow. I'm not sure how they got my number, but apparently, there was data sharing back then that required some type of consent, right? And I got recruited into the iPlanet Sun Alliance, or the AOL Sun Alliance, and then from there, just kind of continued both in the identity space as well as in the cyberspace. So spent about 15 years doing just identity, and then hopped back over to the cyber side, becoming joining as one of the first couple dozen employees at Imperva. Back, I want to say in 2008, 2009. And then really saw kind of this inculcation, this need to bring cyber together with identity. And I think that's one of the core tenets of the podcast, right? Is identity's at the center. And whether that's the center of your application security or the center of your user security, becomes a fundamental part to building out your next generation of applications. Sorry to give you a plug, guys, but it's too easy, right?
Definitely love that. I always love hearing about somebody's journey in this industry, because usually they started off somewhere, like, I don't want to say the bottom, right? But they started out somewhere in kind of the guts of the machine. Like, you started off with the Netscape directory, which of course is kind of like core functionality, but it was, more or less the back office. And now you sit here, Chief Strategy Officer at Cloudentity. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that role.
Yeah, so I think I alluded to it right in that previous monologue. But what we've done is we've looked to bring dynamic authorization, and what I mean when I say that is bring in a lot more context, right? And that can be cyber context, it could be consent context, and push it all the way out to the edge of the service. And so we started thinking, how can we start building product around this? Looking at microservices, API-led infrastructure. Back in 2015, 2016, and then started rolling, intelligence on top of it. And machine learning is a much better descriptor than AI, but I know AI is more in vogue to use those words these days. So we started pulling these different pieces together, right? Making sure that we could have adequate data sets, adequate rules, and adequate policy decision points at the edge of the service. And as we've built that, started getting believers both in the marketplace, right, meaning some early adopters of our technology, as well as believers in the VC marketplace, and underwent our first round of funding last year. As part of that, I kind of shifted out of the sheer tech point of view and really moved into, how can we lead the team? How can we start building a bigger, broader team? And we've been able to bring in some incredible talent, both from people running in the OAuth circles, as well as other IAM platforms.
So, Nathaniel, I was kind of wondering, when you go to a prospect, is this something they've sought you out because they understand your technology, or are you usually going through an education process?
So I'd say that's actually really transitioning over the last 3 to 6 months, right? So part of it's due to COVID, part of it's due to the adoption of distributed services. But what we're seeing is that, as people move into their next generation of services, and whether that's a Kubernetes or a service mesh or functions, they have no idea how to bring identity constructs into that, much less cyber constructs. And one of the big goals as you're building, this next generation services is to make them immutable, right? So how can I externalize identity, authorization, and privacy make that incredibly easy for my developers. So anytime I bring in a new service, it's protected by a default set of rules. So if we think about like identity for the last 24 years, right? What's been the hard part? It's always been onboarding applications, bar none. And now you're starting to have the capabilities to automate that onboarding, right? Make it very, very seamless. I can onboard 10,000 services in a matter of minutes, so long as they're next generation services that are API driven. So you're able to really start driving innovation forward. And instead of becoming this kind of tax that happens after the fact, you're able to lead the digital transformation by saying, I'm going to make these parts easy for you. And we can even talk about that from a customer perspective. Now, the reason that we have open banking like at the center of this discussion is because that's really one of the first mandated and regulated areas where APIs have to be, the center, meaning the first, real API-centric transaction requirements coming from, federal bodies or government regulatory bodies, depending upon the nationality.
So we talked about open banking here a little bit. I guess why don't we start with what is open banking? Because I think people may be using it and they don't maybe even know it, right? I think of services, maybe something like Plaid, where you're connecting different financial services together, or I think, Mint, Personal Capital, there's a bunch of these out there that lets you interface and pool financial data, right, into third-party apps that aren't necessarily owned by the financial institution themselves. Is that a good explanation of it, or is there more to it?
You're hitting on the core tenets, right? And it's really about the democratization of banking, right? So I won't build a bank, but I'll be able to build a service that can consume bank data. And then the second aspect of it is the utilization of privacy and consent, right? So we've seen GDPR, CCPA, things of that nature kind of bubble down on a larger industry basis. But then open banking's been very, very explicit in the flows. Here's where I need to consent to what. Here's how fine-grained that consent that consent should be. And we're also seeing that start to now percolate into some of the different standards bodies, right? So, what we've seen just in the last, 6 to 7 months is a grant management standard pop into the OAuth. Into the OAuth standards bodies. And that's becoming increasingly important because everybody, every user now wants to understand where their data goes. They're tired of seeing, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica, examples, or the Experian data breach that just happened, last week or the week before last, I'm sorry, where highly unsecured API, no authentication, right, for a user or for another service, no authorization, and the only constructs protecting it was public data, meaning my birth date, I'm sorry, not even my birthday, first name, last name, my address, and then a unvalidated birth date, right? So you can program, and when you're using it in an API perspective, right, you can programmatically go and just download all of it, right? You can literally iterate all the way through it, taking public records that you either pull from the dark web or maybe you have, from Peridot or something like that, right? And just boom, 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 right? And now I've got everybody's credit score number. And that's sensitive data to me. I'm sure it is to everybody else listening as well.
So I think one of the challenges that I've seen, having been a consumer of some of these services, is the inconsistency with how they may be implemented. And I think of things where, you have to go into this interface, you type in your ID and password for the target financial institution, and if they have MFA in place or some other type of second factor that you need to provide, it's a very sticky situation sometimes where you're waiting. It's almost like they're doing screen scraping behind the scenes sometimes, and it's frustrating for me as a consumer, right? Trying to keep my accounts linked. How does and me not knowing enough of how it works between the open banking standards and that have been developed and companies who maybe aren't using it, is that a symptom of a poor implementation of it? Is just how it works right now, or maybe they're not even using open banking, and that's why my experience is so poor?
So if they are screen scraping, they're not using open banking. Screen scraping is a security vulnerability, right? They're doing an impersonation against both probably your bank's standards of conduct as well as even their partners' standards of conduct that you're logging into, and that's been kind of the de facto, right, for the last half dozen years, right? As we've seen financial aggregators really come to fruition. Now that's changing because, of open banking, right? Literally everybody realizes that's a big problem. So how do we start to normalize that? How do we build common patterns around consent and around data, all right, flows? So if you're seeing screen scrape, if you're seeing that delay, you're probably not in open banking, in an open banking ecosystem, and you don't have the security that's wrapped around open banking. Now, I'm actually going to go back to your earlier point, Jeff, and It's a lot worse than we actually think, particularly over here in North America. And what I mean by that is, we've got all of this identity and authorization sprawl. So depending on when your application was built, right? Maybe it was a 2008 mobile app, or maybe it's a 2020 mobile app. You probably have a different IDP. You have hard-coded authorization. You have hard-coded privacy built into it, and even those different services or those different applications from a singular bank don't talk to each other well. Now, the banks are obviously trying to fix that and kind of give a little bit better user experience, but I can jump, within some of the credit bureaus, I can jump from service to service to service, and I'll have to re-authenticate, I'll have to re-authorize, I'll have to re-grant consent because none of it's stored outside of the application. It's all hard-coded in there, and nobody has any good way of reporting. Now, that's obviously a tremendous liability for the banks, the credit bureaus, et cetera, or for any of the financials, because they're storing it in different data. And anytime a regulatory body comes and says, hey, show me, prove to me that Nathan allowed you to use his account data, prove to me that Nathan allows you to use his last name. And they have to go and say, okay, well, I don't know what my policies look like, right? I've got to find the developer that wrote that application. That developer has to go back to the code. More than likely, that developer's in another company by now, right? They have to go back into the code, try and pull it, extract it, and then showcase exactly what transpired, right? You and I both know that's almost an impossibility, right? The reality is going across all those different systems and platforms, trying to showcase exactly what happened within a transaction is a lot harder than it even is to explain, right? So being able to externalize that, normalize it, right, and then use a common authorization, privacy, identity standard across all of them. Well, that's exactly what OAuth was designed to be. And what I mean by that is we saw OAuth and OIDC kind of pop out in 2012, right? 2011, 2012, depending upon which one we're going to count by. And the design there was, let's separate context, right? Let's separate the authorization construct away from the identity, the session building, right? But what we saw the industry do is we took, kind of these big monoliths that we've been using for WAM, for the 2000s. Oh, and let's layer on top of Federation. Well, we're already using SAML. Let's layer on top OAuth, right? Or let's layer on top all these things. We took a monolith, we threw another monolith at it, right? And we built kind of these giant constructs that are difficult to use, difficult to upgrade, and aren't meeting the needs of modern application developers. And so what we did is we said, well, what happens if we go back to the original intent, right? What happens if we think about authentication as a session generation? And then there's all kinds of great context that comes from your authentication provider. And then authorization and application identity, that's a whole separate construct. And then when I want to move into finer grained authorization, or I want to move into fine grained consent management, or I want to layer on top, open banking based regulatory demands, now I can do that very, very simply, right? I can spin up open banking APIs in minutes instead of saying, well, I've got to build this giant sandbox. I've got to upgrade my OAuth server to FAPI 1.0 compliance. I've got to do all of these different things, which could be man months or even man years.
I'm curious because I highlighted my poor experience with not having open banking in my life.
Right.
Right. So in your mind, and I'm curious, what does good look like from an open banking implementation? Is there a gold standard or an example that you can kind of provide to say, if you're doing it right, here's what it should look like? What's the process as just a normal customer trying to collect my finances?
So I'm going to do one better than that, and I'm going to talk about the gold standard that we've seen already in the UK. And so there's a company called Sterling Bank. Obviously, we're not familiar with them in North America so much. But what the millennials and Gen Z have said is, I want all of my financial services, and this is not just banking and moving money around, but also home insurance, car insurance, life insurance, right? All these different financial services available in a singular portal. And by using open banking, now Sterling Bank has created that portal for Gen Z, and they've seen tremendous account adoption because of it. What they've seen is a tremendous boon, right, to account adoption by third parties and by additional new customers, because now they have kind of this comprehensive ecosystem. They never have to leave that Sterling Bank's portal. They're able to see, okay, I'm going to sign up for these different insurance, different retirement funds, different investment means, as well as do their regular banking, all from a singular interface. And it's completely changed the way that people interact with them. And that's what, the account aggregators, that the mints, et cetera, have striven to do in North America, but without having kind of this common symbiotic methodology of exchanging data, of protecting privacy, of all of these different fundamental features of open banking. They're just not able to get there in a secure manner.
It sounds to me like the millennials and Gen Z are driving the demand for open banking. Would you say that's accurate? And you know, I'm kind of wondering about the value proposition for the banks. Is this something that they want to be able to enable these financial aggregators in a secure way, or is it, a compliance driver?
So it started as a compliance driver. Well, that was a two-part question. Let me start from the beginning, right? So, first of all, Gen Z and millennials are the first digital natives, right? Gen Z even more so than millennials, meaning they grew up always on, internet's everywhere, services should be everywhere. So they're looking for distributed services and the best user experience possible. That means pushing the service all the way down to the edge of the millennial or the edge of the Gen Zer, right? So my phone's got to be able to do everything in that circumstance. So if we look at, banks, we've seen banks, banks are responsible for where we are today. And what I mean by that is not just technological innovation, but innovation across, infrastructure, et cetera, right? Banks have really stepped up to the plate in the last, 5,000 years, I think is a fair way to say it, right? Due to the exchange of money in helping us build the world as we know it today. And so when they first started adopting open banking, you're right. It was absolutely, a cross to bear. It was literally, it's another regulatory burden that we have to kind of pass through. But we've started to see that transition where it's no longer seen as that because not only are they getting better engagement from their customer communities, but now they're actually getting much better visibility into how their services are being used. What APIs are being called, who are their biggest users, how are they transferring money, what other partnerships and what other services should they package and integrate that are allowing them to better monetize their customers. So all of that data, that very rich data that now they are allowed to have because they have the appropriate consent, is also the data that's feeding back into a circular loop of better services, which they're able to, again, to offer out and to monetize and to build better customer adherence.
Have you seen any differences in how the pandemic has affected uptake of some of these services? Around getting open banking off the ground and becoming more digital first. Less touch, and I look around in my hometown where I'm at, and I see bank branches shutting down. Right, they don't have the physical presence anymore. I can't remember the last time I went into a bank. I've been digital banking for at least it feels like 10 years. And that's probably the trend for the future. And I see a lot of those spaces being repurposed for other things. One's been turned into an electric car charging a spot because they have the parking and no one else is using it. But I'm curious if, from your perspective, having worked on this much more closely, is if the pandemic has driven this any more than it probably would have gone already, just through the natural flow and evolution of services, or if there was something here where COVID's here and we've got to kind of speed this up maybe faster than we were planning on doing it.
You're bang on, right? I feel like that was a softball, I'll be honest, because what has COVID done? It's pushed work from home. It's pushed distributed services out everywhere. And whether that's, upgrading your VPN into a ZTNA, per the podcast last week, or whether that's offering your services out in a very distributed fashion and a very integrated fashion out to your consumers or to your partners to resell, right? Both of those are driving at lightning speed. You're right. We don't go into any branches anymore. I mean, even Starbucks, I have to order online, right? Then I can go pick it up from a branch. But, the reduction in touch interaction, I think, is a fair way of saying it, due to COVID, has really pushed net new digital services and net new ways to engage with your customer base out into the marketplace.
I'm thinking about these open banking APIs, and I'm wondering, are banks deploying the APIs as bolt on to their applications and their systems, or are they deploying the APIs and then building their services on top of it? And I guess I'm getting at that from the standpoint of the security being layered at the API level, right? It seems to me that if you're building apps on top of it, you'd still want to put that security at the API level. So, broad question, I guess, is, are the banks themselves using those APIs they're deploying? And then why is securing at the API level necessary?
Okay, lots of questions there. So let's just parse them out one by one, right? So when we look at open banking, I break it into kind of three major fundamental steps. So the first is building an API-driven infrastructure. And this is where you'll create a net new API, through Apigee or Axway or one of the API gateway vendors to your backend services, right? And that's step one. And that is just to participate in an API-driven ecosystem, which obviously open banking is one of them. Step two is bringing in that security layer, right? So open banking has designated FAPI, which is Financial API. It's a standard put out by the OIDF, the OpenID Foundation, that mandates a number of things. Big things like pairwise identifiers, right? So shared secrets essentially is an easy way to think about that. Mutual TLS between client and server. Secure software assertions, right? So you have a signed certificate that says I can be a client of this service. Are kind of the fundamental pieces, right? So they have mandated a gold standard for API security is the easiest way to think about that. And I think that should be carrying across all industries, because we wouldn't have the Experian problem, right? Just to relate it back today if that was in place yesterday, right? Now, the third step is that consent factor. And I think this is where things start to get really, really interesting, because consent has kind of changed rather dramatically in the last 5 years, right? So started off with GDPR. We got all of these kind of blanket consents. We got the pop-up ad, or the pop-up banner saying, hey, I'm consenting to my cookie, take all of my data or store your cookie here and capture my IP and everything else, which we all hate, but it seems to be a necessary part of using the internet at this juncture, right? So that's been around for a little while, and that was kind of the start of how do I mitigate, some of the GDPR needs. That's a very blanket-based consent. The second is the OAuth-based consents, right? That I think most of us are familiar with. This is where I go into Facebook, and Facebook says, hey, I want to see your first name, last name, phone number, and I'm going to do whatever I want with it, right? I'm going to store it, and it's going from you now. And that's the second one. And that's definitely not fine-grained enough, right? Because there's no real consent. There's just, hey, take my data and do whatever with it. Now, the third one, which open banking has introduced, is really consent that actually happens before the OAuth consent. That is, I'm going to consent and give very fine-grained consent around this account with this transaction ID, and I'm going to consent to sending it to this third party, right? And this is where those third-party providers and the aggregators really come to bear. And so what we're seeing is very disconnected approaches to consent, kind of, again, based upon that sprawl we were talking about earlier. You might have the blanket consent, you might have some OAuth consent, but unless you're in the OBA ecosystem, the open banking ecosystem, you're not bringing to fruition the open bank consent. So what we've done is we brought all of those together, right? So you have a common model for consent that spans those three different types, actually a fourth type as well, but we'll dive down the rabbit hole if we go that way. So I have a common model for understanding what I've consented to an organization, as well as what I've consented to an organization to share about me. And I can go and revoke, manage it. I can give you, you can use it one time, you can use it 7 times, you can use it for 30 days, you can use it for 24 hours, right? So I've got very fine-grained controls around how I'm willing to share my data out to an organization and how that organization has to treat the data going out to third parties. Sorry, the rest of your question was, where should API security lie, right? And so the very interesting thing about APIs is something like 80% of the internet traffic is now API driven, right? And you have to think about APIs as machine to machine, right? Or service to service, because that is the fundamental underlying flow, right? And whether it's me going through my iPad, right, through an app on my iPad, it's making an API call back up to, Wells Fargo or to my bank. And that is a machine-to-machine communication. So we have to start rethinking identity. So we've always thought about identity as a user identity, right? Super easy. I know how to authenticate users, right? We can do that very well, although we don't do that very well, but that's a different point of discussion. Now, when we start thinking about identity of machines, right, I've got two different aspects of that. I've got workload identity, and this is like the Carbon, right? This is my function that's spun up, or my Kubernetes node, or my Kubernetes pod, sorry, that I just spun up. That Kubernetes pod, registers, and if it's in something like Istio or Service Mesh, it'll go and get its own what's called a SPIFFE, service provider identity for everything, which is an X509 cert essentially that's giving a very short term, oftentimes it's 90 minutes to 2 hours, identity down to the workload. Now, what we've done is we've also brokered that so we can take a SPIFFE identifier and now I'll assign a service identifier, OAuth client ID, down to that workload identity. Brought those together, and now we have a much better way of governing a user accessing a service identity, which is tied to a machine identity. So I have independent client identities that are now tied to different workload identities. So every instance of my service that spins up has its own unique identity instead of the old way, which was I had an API key, right, that was shared across 100 different services or 1,000 different services even. Now I have individual X509 certs So if I have a breach, I can know exactly which individual instance it was, as opposed to, oh, my service got breached. And I can say this service instance got breached, and I'm going to go and rectify and look at the audit logs for that as well.
That sounds pretty spiffy to me. No, one thing I thought as you were describing that framework, which included open banking, you peel out kind of the open banking thing. I'm just kind of freestyling here. It sounds very much like a framework that can be used across industries, which I think is what you said. Um, but I was also having the thought that I think, to put it in OAuth parlance, you're talking a lot about um, allowing certain scopes. Um, it kind of put me into the mindset of thinking of when it comes to that, I mean, that's almost functionality. Sure, it's security, so especially from an authorization context, but that's really like at the core of functionality of what is happening here.
Jim, you're right. So, kind of putting it into that OAuth scope parlance, right? So, what we're talking about thus far was all like OAuth client credential flows, right? How am I going to get a service identity to a machine identity? Now, when I start talking about how am I going to authorize data, and whether that's privacy related data, via grants, or even other data that might be PII, that might not be PII, those are the scopes that you're talking about. And so, what we've done, and not to kind of toot our own horn too much, but is we built governance around those scopes. So as a developer, I have governance that covers exactly what's going to transpire. So when I register a service, I can no longer ask for, hey, I want that full JOT, I want the full user record, I need all this data, unless I actually need it, right? And that's a very different way of treating it. So I just used this metaphor on the Open Banking World Congress just last week. But what we're seeing is that PII, right, for the last decade has been called, it's the new oil, right? From whether it's Harvard Business Review or CIO Monthly. But what's really becoming is the new CO2, right? Because we're not able to control it. We're not able to constrain it. It's propagating wildly because we're sending these giant JOTs or these giant access tokens from service to service to service. No idea where the data goes, right? It might get dumped into syslog. It might get pumped out to another API that we're unaware of. It might go into any recording platform, or it might go to a rogue service. No clue once it's out the door. So by actually doing governance around the access token that's being minted, right? What are we able to do? We're able to say service A can see the full user record. Service B can only see first name and transaction ID.
I think of all the things that can go wrong from a security perspective when it comes to APIs, and then you toss in like Facebook wanting to be having access to financials. Right? You mentioned Facebook. I'm like, oh, there's no way I'm ever going to allow like Facebook to be financially connected to the rest of my stuff, right? But that's just an editorial comment anyway. From a security perspective, what is the worst thing that could happen if the open banking APIs, or really just APIs in general, aren't properly secured? I mean, obviously there's theft, right? Someone could intercept and steal money. I think of Initech, if you're a fan of Office Space, where you're maybe developing an API that just takes fractions of a penny, right, from a bunch of different accounts, and you hope you're never caught. What are some of the other things that maybe aren't as noticeable from a security perspective that people should be concerned about and drive towards making sure that APIs are properly governed, are properly secured, and being utilized the way that they've been designed to?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's actually relatively scary. Like when we start to actually talk about it, because if I look at what's driving my Tesla, it's APIs, right? It's calls from a service on my steering wheel and my accelerator down to the central control panel, and then talking out to the internet somewhere. So what's the worst case scenario? Well, somebody takes that over, and we've seen it hacked many a time already. And I think Dodge, not Tesla necessarily, but Dodge and a few other ones have had their auto drive features and APIs hacked. We saw that with just Mercedes. I believe that was the end of last year. It wasn't a hack of the driving system, but it was a hack of the data coming through the Bluetooth platform, right? So it's not just personal data, but your actual livelihood, right, can be impacted. And whether it's a heart monitor as an IoT device, or whether it's the car that you're driving, right? Not doing API security right is going to fundamentally put you at risk and put your organization at risk for not just financial liabilities, but potentially livelihood of people.
Yeah, I think about that too, and it's a connected world, and if a human designed it, that means that there are flaws in it, and there will be ways to break systems as they've been designed. I know that you've been very generous with your time with us, and one of the things that we've started to do is kind of close out with maybe something not so IAM, so that we're not leaving on a heavy note, right? Try to lighten the mood after the doom and gloom of not having APIs being secured and not having all your money stolen and Facebook watching you. Jim came up with a good one. I'll let him have the honors. Jim, why don't you go for it?
Yeah, but before I do that, Jeff, I want to remind you they are fractions of a penny. Have you seen the penny dish at the convenience store? They're for everyone.
Right. Community
That's-
pennies.
That's a little office space chatter, if you will. So my non-IM question, and this is really timely because of my gas guzzler that I mentioned earlier. My non-IM question is, what is the coolest car you've ever owned? And I'm going to start with Nathaniel.
Oh, I got a two-part answer on this one too. So I still own it. So I have a 77 BJ40, which is the old Land Cruiser. But the BJ is a diesel designation. I imported it from Canada, I don't know, 25 some odd years ago. So it's kind of like a diesel Jeep essentially. That's incredibly low geared, seemingly can drive up trees, although I would never hurt a tree. Second one would be an F100. So I've got a 52 F100 that's in my garage. That's, I mean, it's pretty to look at, and that's more my wife's car. but I bought it for her. So
This is a tough question for me too. My first car is like, I loved it so much. It was the '69 Ford Falcon with dry rotted winter tires. So in other words, these tires were like, if I stepped on the gas, they spun and left a black streak behind me and left a bunch of smoke because they were just like, just so old of tires and everything. But that was a fun car. I had a 72 Nova SS in college. I drive a Mustang convertible now. But I think the funnest car I've ever owned was I had an '88 VW Vanagon with one of those tops that popped up and became a tent, and it had a full size bed under it and a full size the back seat folded down to become a full size bed. It had a kitchen and a refrigerator in it. I mean, it was like my hippie mobile. So that thing was, everybody loved it. It was a conversation piece. The only downside well, there's two downsides. One was, I mean, the thing broke down a lot. So it was in the shop about as much as it was in my garage. The second thing is it was a gas guzzler. So when gas was cheap, that was no problem. But when gas got expensive, and like I'm experiencing right now, where gas is non-existent in my part of the country, that was not the best. So with that, I already know what Jeff's answer is going to be. So go ahead. I'll pass it to you, Jeff.
Well, okay, so I'm not a car person at all. I'm more of a, the tech geek nerd. So of course my answer is probably not going to be a surprise, but it is definitely my 2018 Tesla Model 3. Absolutely love that vehicle. Absolutely perfect. Never had a problem with it. At least no major problems, right? Stuff that, little things here and there. But it is so much fun to drive an electric vehicle. I'm a Tesla fan just because, they were the ones that came out ahead of time and the one that was available. And I've been waiting on that one for a while. So I guess you could coin that my maybe midlife crisis car, but I think it's fantastic. I have not been to the gas station in, I don't know, at least 6 months, maybe even longer, mostly just to fill up my wife's car. And I haven't, I can't remember the last time I had to take care of an oil change or anything like that. I mean, the only maintenance I've had to do on it is putting in windshield washer fluid, and that's it. So I absolutely love the Tesla. It's just so much fun to drive, and I think it's not specific to Tesla, right? The quick acceleration and the torque that you get from an electric motor. Most electric cars are a lot of fun to drive, and it comes down to probably the comforts that come around it. But yeah, absolutely, it is my Tesla. That is my pride and joy, and I'm already looking forward to my next EV and whether I'll stay within the Tesla brand or maybe look at something like we're kind of talking about this last night, my wife and I, around maybe the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which is, I know. There is polarizing of whether you should be using the Mustang name for an electric vehicle. but it looks pretty sharp and seems to have some pretty good metrics around it. So I'm gonna go with my Tesla. That's my jam, and it's a lot of fun to drive. So I think with that, that's probably a good spot where we can go ahead and leave it. We had a pretty good mix of vehicles there between trucks and hippie mobiles and Mustangs and Tesla. So I think we covered really the wide variety of vehicles that could potentially be out there. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully people were able to get idea of kind of, at least if they aren't familiar with open banking, how they might already be using it and not even just be aware of it, but how technologies and standards are developing to make life easier to be able to manage finances, and and underneath it all, there's identity, right? It's part of this process, et cetera. I will have a link to Nathan in the show notes if you want to connect with him on LinkedIn. Obviously, you can connect with Jim and I is there as well. We're always happy to engage and talk with our listeners and get ideas for shows and so forth. Also have a link to Cloudentity's website, so you can learn more about what Nathan and his company has been doing in this space, so you can get familiar with their offering. And for us, right, you can always find us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. You can find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. Appreciate everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.